Good morning. My name is Mamuka Tsereteli. I'm a senior fellow at Central Asia-Caucasus Institute at American Foreign Policy Council. Good morning for those of you who are in the United States, and good evening to our viewers and participants in Central Asia. And I assume there are participants from other parts of the world as well. I'm here to substitute our planned interviewer, award-winning journalist Sami Mahdi, who, like many others, our friends, colleagues, fellows of Central Asia-Caucasus Institute's Rumsfeld Fellowship Program, is dealing with his personal situation, and hopefully in a few weeks we'll all get together again, and Sami, as well as many others, will join us to have more substantive and broader conversation about developments in Afghanistan and around it. This idea of this interview with Dr. Fred Starr, chairman of Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, was born about months ago when Fred returned from the conference in Tashkent that was dedicated to regionalism in Central Asia. And we were planning to discuss this new trend of regionalism where Central Asia, Afghanistan, in a broader sense, Central Asia, supposed to be in the center of discussion about new trends, new developments. But obviously, events were taken our thinking about event today, and discussion will be mostly focused on Afghanistan today. But obviously, it will be put in a broader context of not just the region, but also how global powers and interests are presented in this region. So, Fred, nice to see you. And why don't we start with like basic question? So we see Taliban is in power. What shall we expect in terms of Taliban government? And what are the prospects of this government, in your opinion? Why don't we start with this question first?
Good. Well, first of all, let's waste no time looking backwards. Let's just play it from where we stand at this moment. And here we have a very complex picture with a lot of contradictions. One thing's absolutely clear, no one doubts this, that the Taliban are quite willing to use force and fear to gain control and to keep it. They've seized TV, press, and radio, and let's not forget they murdered Dawa Khan Minapal, who was head of government media and information center. These are all just fragmentary bits of evidence on their resolution. That's not in question. On the other side, though, life is not so simple for the new rulers of Afghanistan. They do face, in spite of their clean sweep, they do face various forms of opposition. I'm not speaking about former warlords like Ismail Khan, who was routed in Herat, or the Uzbek Dostum, who fled from his base in Sheberghan, but there are still regional and local powers who have thoughts of their own. Also, let's not forget that the Taliban themselves emptied the prisons in some cases. They picked up some fighters of their own, but they also released some dangerous characters into society. Now, most important seems to me that we talk about those who supported the United States and the NATO mission in Afghanistan, making sure they are able to leave the country. Well, let's be blunt, that's totally impossible, because it was millions who were engaged with the new Afghanistan, and who are, through education, through their businesses, and so on, because the country has been significantly changed, if not transformed, since 2001. Urbanization, the growth of communications, effective news media, and so forth. Now, the vast majority of these new Afghans, who tend to be younger, tend to be much better educated, tend to be much more cosmopolitan, the vast majority of them are not able to leave even if they want to, and they aren't leaving. That means that sooner or later, the Taliban government is going to have to deal with. They can't be ignored. Now, beyond this, most important is that the Taliban's own leader, Abdul Ghani Baradar, has said, it's a very revealing statement. He said the real test is, can we meet the public's expectations? That's sober realism. Now, how widespread is it among the Taliban? We don't know. And most important, do the people trying to meet the public's expectations have any real control over some of these Taliban gangsters at the most local level? We don't know that. But the fact is, they have to deal with this reality. They have to somehow convince people that beyond simply the exertion of force against the population, that the government is doing things that are at least acceptable to most Afghans. So that's not an easy challenge. It makes their prospects much more complicated. It means the possibility, at least, of a very different Taliban than we saw earlier.
Fred, to what extent these developments in Afghanistan, in your opinion, will depend on support from external powers, and what role you think they will be playing going forward?
That's a very important issue. Let me just do a very quick rundown, and this is very telegraphic, but I think it reveals the extent to which a lot of foreign actors are involved in this. First of all, let me mention China. They received the Taliban in Beijing as early as 2012. The foreign minister of China has spoken very optimistically about having assurances from the Taliban that they would make a clean break, his term, with terrorism. Well, let's see. We'll believe that when we see it, but there you are. Also, let's note that the Chinese have committed to building the Peshawar-Kabul Railroad. That's an important rail link, east-west rail link. And by the way, it is the rail link which eventually copper from the Ainak mine, which the Chinese own in south of Kabul, that's how that copper will get to market. They also, Chinese are not ignorant of the fact that they only need to read the American Geological Survey's study of Afghanistan's resources, an astonishing study, and basically concluded there's $1 trillion worth of rare earths in Afghanistan. The Chinese know that. They're well positioned to get these, and they're quite active in mobilizing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to support their approach. Now, Russia, very different situation. They never really gave up after they left. Just take note of the Russian Cultural Center that was built a couple of years ago in the center of Kabul. Lavrov even has received Taliban officials, even though the Taliban is officially banned in Russia. They are quite eager to replace the United States as an arms supplier, and President Ghani was ready to buy Russian helicopters before he left office. That had already advanced. So Russia very much in the game, although by no means with the resources or the scope of the Chinese. Others are relevant. Pakistan, my goodness, what a riddle. Quetta has long been a major Taliban center, and there is also, let's not forget, the very significant internal Pakistani Taliban. That one of the Pakistani officials said that, in fact, the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban are simply two faces of the same coin. This poses a real serious domestic challenge. Will the activation of the Taliban in Afghanistan as a government, creating an emirate on the border of Pakistan, how will this affect Pakistan internally? Very complex situation. I think it's far too early to prognosticate, but will this be an important factor? Yes. India, quite unknown at this point. We'll see how they choose to respond. They have the keenest interests in this. Will they pursue them alone, or will they do it in conjunction with the proposed US, India, Japan, Europe quadrilateral linkage? Turkey, barely mentioned in the press up to now. Yet, let's not forget, aside from building the airport in Kabul, the Turks have been, during the entire period of American presence and Western presence in Afghanistan, it's the Turks who carried the goods by truck from overland to Afghanistan. They are very well positioned. They will not close their eyes to possibilities there. So we'll have to see. Arabs, another question. Look at the big new Saudi Muslim center in the heart of Kabul. This is meant as a response to the American University of Afghanistan. But they do have big interest there, especially in containing Iran. And about still another force that I've not mentioned at all, Iran is not blind to all this going on and is watching it very closely, how they plan to use their common language with the Dari official Dari of Afghanistan to get their message across remains to be seen.
We'll talk about Central Asian neighbors of Afghanistan in a moment, but before going there, somewhat rhetorical question. Does Afghanistan still matter?
Well, that's a rhetorical question, but a very, very important one. And rest assured that the Western and American press will frame it that way. Now, from one perspective, you might say that the so-called pivot to Asia, about which we've been hearing for a decade, that the pivot to Asia puts Afghanistan and, for that matter, all Central Asia somehow in the background. That has been argued. It has been advanced as a thesis by members of the State Department and some others. But we could also consider that the opposite thesis is relevant and maybe more relevant, and that is that exactly the pivot to Asia, such as it is, makes Afghanistan and Central Asia all the more important. Why? Because it has always been, both Afghanistan and the larger Central Asian region, the true pivot of Inner Asia. And look at it this way. If this region loses its capacity for self-determination, loses its type of modern sovereignty, and if it falls under the sway of any external power, as opposed to some balanced relationship among several external powers, if that were to happen, it would dramatically change not just Central Asia, Afghanistan itself, but it would change the entire dynamics of Asia. Why? Because this would create the kind of power vacuum that would invite a major power, whether it's China or Russia or anyone else, to become a dominant hegemon, if you will, in the region. That is the biggest prospect that any great power in Asia can hold out, I suppose, beyond Taiwan for China, but control in Central Asia, controlling the local sovereignties in Central Asia and Afghanistan is the biggest step that either Russia or China could take in advancing their interests. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with the very clear notion that Central Asia, which includes Afghanistan, are very, very central to any pivot to Asia. And one wants to be sure that these remain self-governing sovereign states that are not under the direct reach and control of any external power, notably China or Russia.
Fred, how does Central Asia figure in all this? And again, you were there about a month ago. You were coming with some very positive feelings from Tashkent conference. So
well, I don't want to sound naive or overly optimistic, but even in this very dark moment, there are some very positive signs in the larger region, and these should not be ignored. So my short answer to your very pertinent question is that Central Asia figures centrally in the entire discussion of Afghanistan. And external powers, including the United States, NATO, etc., but also China, Russia, India, Pakistan, must understand how important this dimension has become. All Central Asians, including Afghans, know that Afghanistan has for 3,000 years been part of Central Asia, sharing common links, values, traditions, cultures, and so forth. Now, what's happened, very interestingly, in the last couple of years, both the Central Asians and the Afghans, meaning the outgoing Afghanistan government, have acknowledged this relationship and sought to re-embrace the region as such. They are coming together as a world region, if you will. And in July 16, there was held in Tashkent a really remarkable conference convened by President Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan, in which he brought presidents of half dozen countries, a couple of dozen foreign ministers, technical experts, educators, and so forth. They all came, and the subject was reopening links between former Soviet states of Central Asia and Afghanistan, and simultaneously reopening transport and trade links to the south. And both of these were advanced as important strategic objectives of all the countries in the region, and including Afghanistan. And both of them were defended as our, meaning collectively, the states of Central Asia, including Afghanistan, as our initiative, not as the special initiative of Turkmenistan or Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, but of all of them together, including Afghanistan. Now, this is amazing because finally, after years of discussion, the presidents are meeting on a regular basis. Interestingly, Turkmenistan, which has long been considered an outlier on the Central Asian collective front, actually the president of Turkmenistan, Berdi Muhamedov, through his foreign minister, invited the other regional presidents, including the head of Afghanistan, to Ashgabat for a meeting which has already taken place on the 6th. And by doing this, President Berdi Muhamedov signaled that we, Turkmen, are fully a part of this emerging Central Asian region. We want to be a bridge between north of the Amu Darya River, the former Soviet states, and Afghanistan, and by that means help weld the region together. Now, and thanks to all this effort, which has been slowly advancing for quite a few years. You have regular meetings taking place with the foreign ministers, with technical experts, think tank people, also medical people, water people, and gradually, but now with increasing speed, Central Asia with Afghanistan is emerging as a world region. Now, what about Afghanistan in this? What about the Taliban? Well, there have been very close ties between individual officials in Central Asia and all political forces in Afghanistan, including the Taliban. They know each other. They've been in contact, just as the Central Asians were in contact with the government that fell the other day. They realize that they must have, that they cannot draw a hard line as occurred in Soviet times between us and them, that we have to somehow find a common language with Afghanistan. Now that involves two-way influence, of course. Yet I think we have to realize that this is one of the important developments, that the states of Central Asia north of the Amu Darya, these states can exert a very positive and constructive influence on a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. In other words, this is suddenly emerging as a real region, and that is seeking a peaceful and productive relationship with Afghanistan, even under Taliban rule. Now, what does this mean for the West, for NATO, for the United States? Well, very simply, it seems to me that what they are advancing, the all collective Central Asian voice, is the reopening of the ancient trade channels to the south. Now, all of this region, including Afghanistan, as things stand, have far better trade and transport links to Russia and to China than they do to India or Southeast Asia. They all want to open those new links, and that means crossing Afghanistan. The Taliban so far has been very much open to this. The details have all to be worked out, but there is no reason to believe that they will oppose these initiatives. They should indeed welcome them, because they create an income stream that would not otherwise be there. This is a very important geopolitical move. Now, with regard to America, NATO, and so forth, the Central Asians at their conference in August 16 were in fact offering the West the best and least expensive strategic option for Afghanistan and the region, namely to embrace the region as such, including Afghanistan, and play a key role in its evolution and its opening to the south. I think this question remains open in spite of the revolution, if you will, or coup, if you will, that has taken place in Afghanistan. The sooner we explore this possibility and identify its potential, both for them and for us, the better for everyone.
Fred, you mentioned West and United States, and obviously top point of discussion major point of discussion in recent days is role of United States. And there are many different comparisons and assessments and sometimes characterization of US actions as a failure. So we don't want to go there right now, but what are the alternatives at this stage for United States based on what emerged in Afghanistan in the last several days?
Well, a very important and timely question, and obviously any answer that I offer at this moment will be subject to revision over time. However, it is clear one possibility is what I mentioned earlier, namely, continue the present so-called pivot to Asia, ignoring Afghanistan and all of Central Asia. That more or less is what we've been doing for the last few years, and it's not smart and it hasn't worked. I recall back in the 90s, the late 90s, before 9/11, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked, what should we do about Afghanistan? Her response was, build a fence around it and forget about it. Well, this won't work today. And sooner or later, the United States is going to have, and our friends in NATO and Europe are going to have to come to terms with the government that emerges there. There will be contact. I'm not speaking immediately about recognition, but there will be contact. And indeed, let's not forget there was contact with Taliban before 9/11. There was quite a discussion over their production of heroin, and as part of that, the Taliban back then successfully cut back production of poppies, poppy growing, cut them way back for 2 seasons, and 2 missions by the United States confirmed that this had happened. This was all to have been a prelude to further contact with the Taliban. However, there were people in the United States, and I can't judge the position that they took, that people in the United States who argued that the reason the Taliban did this was simply to make heroin more scarce and therefore drive up prices. This argument prevailed in Washington, and without much evidence or without much discussion. But the fact is, we did, under Taliban control prior to 9/11, there were contacts. What I'm suggesting is that given the activity of other major powers in Afghanistan, in the with the Taliban Afghanistan, for the United States to stand back and pretend it doesn't exist is not going to be an option. The question then is, okay, what do we do? Well, it seems to me we should be considering now, what are the conditions that must be met on both sides for serious contact to exist with whatever government emerges in Kabul. That is a question that requires serious discussion. That will, in time, potentially lead to a discussion of what are the conditions that must be met for the United States to recognize whatever government emerges from this revolution in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not saying rush out and recognize them. I'm not saying even rush out and start opening contacts tomorrow. Rather, I'm saying scope out today what are the preconditions for contact, what are the preconditions for recognition, and have clarity on this early in the game, rather than try to improvise on it later on. Now, if we consider this, we should be careful not to assume that we can achieve everything at once. these things take time, especially with any of the variant governments that one can imagine emerging from this chaos in Kabul today. It will take time. But we should bear in mind that if we aren't engaged, if we aren't involved, we'll have no influence on the outcome. That's a very significant point. The absence of the United States and of Europe and for that matter of India, of Japan, of Australia, the absence of these countries in the deliberations within the new government of Afghanistan will leave the entire field to the most zealous authoritarian states on the planet. So if we're not involved, we'll have no influence. That's my point. Now, does the United States in its future dealings with Afghanistan have bargaining chips? Absolutely yes. And the Taliban knows this very well. The possibility of trade, of investment are going to be vitally important to any government that emerges from this mess in Kabul. I'm told by a leading Uzbek expert on Afghanistan that the Taliban themselves realize that one way or another they have to come to terms with Washington if they're going to survive. I can't evaluate that statement, but that has been made and transmitted from senior Taliban, at least one senior Taliban official warrants our attention. Now, what I'm saying is that their economic viability and hence their survival may be more dependent upon their future links with the more open systems of the world, whether Europe, America, Japan, etc., India, etc., then we acknowledge. They are not under illusions about this. They can't just go it alone with China or any other one power, and therefore there may be much more to talk about as time goes on. Again, let me say, I am not saying rush in and seek recognition. I am saying think about all this now, define our conditions, define our objectives, and then over time we'll know better how to implement. Now, where does this leave us? Well, a question that hasn't emerged yet is how do we talk about with Russia and China about the new Afghanistan? Secretary of State Blinken actually contacted his counterparts in both countries and had an initial conversation about this. This is very important. We do have a common interest in preventing terrorism, and that may or may not open the door to some kind of cooperation with regard to the new government. We'll have to wait and see. We shouldn't exclude the possibility of finding common ground with China and Russia on Afghanistan. Now, finally, it seems to me the key to all this is embracing Afghanistan as part of a region. We should join with the region in opening transport and trade routes to the south so that they are not totally dependent on Russia and China. This is just common sense. It's something we should do with any government in Afghanistan and be willing to do because the beneficiaries are the entire region and its ability to maintain a balanced relationship with all the, and balanced and positive relationship with all the great powers. So these are some of the, it seems to me, some of the alternatives and possibilities that the present situation presents.
Fred, before we go to some of the uncertainties that I wanted to kind of ask you a question about going forward, there are a couple of questions from audience. There is one technical, not very technical probably, but important question, which is where Taliban get their arms. Do we know answer to that?
From us.
So it's more likely taking the U.S. weaponry.
I would question whether there has been a more large-scale transfer of arms and advanced weapons anywhere in the world in the last decade or two that greater than what is taking place at this moment in Afghanistan, from the United States directly to the Taliban. It's a gift that they could never have dreamed of.
There's another question probably alluding to somewhat about armament of the Taliban as well. The question is about your comments about relationship between the Pakistani ISS and both Pakistani and Afghan Taliban. And
that is, whole books have been written about this. Ministers in both countries have philosophized about it. They've yelled and screamed at each other about it. I think it's very clear that there are several Pakistans. There is the Pakistan of the government with elected officials and political parties and a surprisingly vital press. There is the Pakistan of the military, a sophisticated and quite closed world. There is the Pakistan of large entrepreneurs who are dealing with modern companies and functioning globally. And there is the Taliban of the countryside. I'm sorry, the Pakistan of the countryside, which includes tens of thousands of people who are directly engaged with the Pakistani version of the Taliban. Now, this is a fact, and one of the and the question is simply, will the Afghan state, will the Pakistani state be either interested in or able to control that faction? Up to now, the answer has been no, and parts of the Pakistani state have actually welcomed the activities of Pakistanis who support the Taliban. This is not going to be solved tomorrow, but let me say, I think those modern sectors in Pakistan may well have reason to worry about the existence of an Islamic emirate on its western border. The implications of this for Pakistan are not all positive, even though it seems to many that they are one of the big beneficiaries of the revolution in Kabul.
Fred, one more question from the audience about, it's Demjan from Baku Dialogue, you probably know him. This is about, you mentioned the rare earth deposits in Afghanistan, and we all know that about a month or 2 months ago, recently, actually the Biden administration and White House issued special document prioritizing exploration and development of different minerals all around the world to create alternatives to dominance of one particular country that possesses most of the rare earths right now. So what else can you say about this particular subject? And can it end up only in a Chinese hand, a Chinese producer's hand, or it could be open to shared access. The key question in general for the region, we see controlling interests. We see powers who are interested in control, while United States and other Western countries always had approach to have shared access to resources and infrastructure and so forth. Do you think there will be attempt to dominate those resources by particularly China's interests?
Of course, absolutely. That goes without saying. I cannot imagine a more ill-informed approach than what the current administration in Washington has taken to the issue of rare earths and so forth. It was the U.S. Geological Survey that did far the most detailed analysis of the mineral resources of Afghanistan. There had been a Soviet study, but the U.S. version went far, far beyond it. And it showed the absolutely spectacular wealth that the country possesses in natural resources, including rare earths. Now, it was utterly clear that in making this announcement, no one in the new administration in Washington even glanced at this study, even though we paid for it. And I'm sure it's being carefully scrutinized in Beijing and in other world capitals. We paid no attention to this in terms of developing with the Afghan government some ability to mine and access these resources. We did nothing along those lines. We did the hard work. We if you will, ramped up the whole project and then walked away from it. I can't imagine anything more foolish.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is not the only occasion. Sometimes infrastructure development that was funded and supported by United States and Western countries are also benefiting more the other actors than interests of United States. But we are getting closer to the end. I really wanted to ask you this question. What are the unknowns going forward? What are we facing going forward in terms of developments in Afghanistan and surrounding areas?
Key question, absolutely important. What don't we know? Well, let me just tip my hat to the late Donald Rumsfeld, a great friend of our institutes, and say we're talking now about the unknown unknowns. One of them is the degree of control that Taliban will be able to exert. We don't know this. It could be great. It could be tyrannical, brutal. It could be very different. It's interesting that Abdul Baradar, who's their functioning head, told the Taliban not to harm captured soldiers and officials who surrender. And also they gave orders to keep open markets and so forth. We'll see how this works out. It's an unknown. Now, will the Taliban seek a deal with the new commercial classes? Not known. Right now, many parts of the country, up until the revolution, younger entrepreneurs and business people were asked to pay a 10% levy to the Taliban. They did, and otherwise they were allowed to go on with their businesses. Will this change? We don't know. Third issue, we have absolutely no clarity on the issue of other extremist groups functioning on the territory of Afghanistan. What about the ISI's Khorasan movement, the eastern movement of the emirate that they were attempting to establish? They're there. How many? What resources? What links with the Taliban? We really don't know. Third, the nature and extent of the involvement of other Central Asian countries in Afghanistan. We have some awareness of this, but it's not something that we have carefully studied. Our US government hasn't, Western governments haven't. But let me simply note that Turkmenistan alone has had very extensive contacts and links thanks to its TAPI pipeline project. Finally, I would say, will Washington be smart enough to adopt a regional approach? This is total unknown. I mean, the question is hardly framed. Or are we going to continue to have these fragmented semi-strategies throughout the region and including Afghanistan? Unknown. Or further, will the US do this alone or with whom? Will it, for example, as many very wise people have said, do it with the four, China, with the four, meaning Europe, India, United States, and Japan, or maybe five, Australia? Well, that's not clear. And finally, what will be the long-term impact of all that is happening in Afghanistan elsewhere in the world? And I have two obvious points of inquiry. First, how will it affect our dealings with Iran? Iran is following this with keenest interest. Only recently they opened their railroad that goes directly to Herat, where people of virtually the same language and culture live in Afghanistan. And what will its impact be on issues as far away as Taiwan, about which the Chinese already have made one rather damning announcement? These are all unknowns, and there are other unknowns beyond what I enumerated, and those will surely emerge as time goes on. But we should be modest about what we know and don't know, and we should be seeking, above all, to be looking forward and not back. You can't drive down the road by looking in the rearview mirror. And let the historians chew over what has happened. That's their business. But in terms of strategy going forward, we have to look out the front windshield in every direction, and we should be anticipating these issues, which we utterly failed to do, in spite of many urgings to the contrary over the last 20 years in Kabul.
Fred, we still have a few minutes, and would you be willing to answer a couple of more questions?
Of course.
Yeah, one question is, what do you think perception will be about value of US commitment to other partner countries, in your opinion, after what happened in Afghanistan? Do you see this as a serious damage for US reputation? Or
how can it not be? How can it not be? Put yourself in the position of any country that is to any degree relying upon the United States, and this throws it all into question. It will take years, maybe generations, to repair the damage to trust that this action has caused.
There's another interesting question here. Based on some reports, there is an announcement that there may be some new Northern Alliance forming in the north. And the question is about possibility of new civil war. Do you see this as a potential scenario?
Very interesting question. I would point out that back at the time of the 9/11, before it and after it, there was a widespread fashion of saying that Afghanistan was going to break apart. Never happened. It didn't happen in 2 generations of pure chaos in the country. Nobody proposed to leave. So I think the centrifugal tendencies are there. They have always been, but the deal, which has existed since the 1750s, somehow is going to have to be reformulated. And that is that the key ruler, the leader, if you will, the king for several centuries, would come from the south, from among the Pashto, and the language of the court and of the government would be Dari, meaning Persianate, from the north. This was a deal, and it worked. And when was the deal broken? It was broken at the Bonn Conference, and responsibility for that should be fixed. We should understand why this happened. Why was the king eliminated? Was this the only option open? But the fact is, those people who are today expecting that the centrifugal tendencies within Afghanistan will prevail, I think, are dead wrong. There will be resistance. There has always been resistance in the north among the Uzbeks and even Turkmen in the west. But this has been contained and controlled and channeled, and I expect it to continue to be so under Taliban rule.
And maybe last question. This is about, we all know that US presence and US military presence in Afghanistan was serving as like public goods to many neighbors, including large powers, because it was handling security situation and actually monitoring and suppressing terrorist activities coming out of Afghanistan to neighboring countries, including Central Asia. Do you see any potential escalation going forward and impact of radicalization spreading into Central Asia going forward? So after several years, Taliban will settle in Afghanistan, or maybe even several months.
Well, this obviously has to be a prime objective of all governments in the region and of governments, including the United States, that wish the region well, to contain any such activity. Now, will this be sponsored by the Taliban itself? I suspect not. They have so much on their plate at the moment. I can't imagine that they would want to waste any energy or personnel on these kinds of adventures abroad. The question that I raised at the beginning, how much control do they actually have, is pertinent here. And it may well be that some remote parts of Afghanistan can still be used by various extremist groups to launch mischief against its neighbors. However, having said that, let me stress again that it's fashionable to say we weren't in Afghanistan to do nation building. Sorry, they didn't need nation building. They had a nation from the 1750s on. No one has proposed to secede from that nation. Did we, in fact, do a fantastic job of promoting development in the country? Transport, communication, information, education, rights of women, et cetera, et cetera. The list is very, very long. So the country is not the same as it was in 2000, 9/11 and 2001. It's a different country. Everyone has cell phones, they're in touch. It's going to be much harder to pull off the kind of mischief that was commonplace back then. So we'll see, just as we will have to see the degree of tyranny and heavy-handedness that the Taliban chooses to exercise. There are many open questions.
I think it's a good probably point to end this conversation. Fred, thank you so much for your knowledge and insight, and thanks for sharing with our audience. Thanks to all for participating, listening, and posting your questions. We apologize not to answering all of them, but we'll try to take them into consideration for our next events, and we'll definitely come back to developments in Afghanistan sometime in probably second part of September, and we'll dedicate forum discussion and maybe a couple of panel discussions on developments to Afghanistan. Thank you again to all, and we'll see you soon at Central Asia-Caucasus forums in near future. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.